this is really, in a way, an excuse for me to have a conversation with Bibek Da. We've set this up so that it's purely out of selfish interest. I can have a one-on-one chat for an hour with Bibek Da and offer that to everybody else. Bibek Debroy has a day job officiating as the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. But the Bibek Da that I've come to know during these last 4 or 5 years is the Bibek Da who's a prolific columnist, translator, author, scholar, and came as a pleasant surprise to me, a great wit as well. So what we'll do today is focus our discussion not on politics, not on economics for a change. We'll give him that respite. But instead, we will talk about his work of translating from the original Sanskrit. Not too many people know this, that he had worked, I think, with Penguin and done a 3-volume translation of the Ramayana, and then subsequently a 10-volume translation of the critical edition of the Mahabharata. And it's really the Mahabharata that we'd like to focus on. So Bibek Da, thanks very much for taking time off your schedule. The first question which sort of strikes one from a purely layman's standpoint is when one is talking about the Mahabharata purely from a literary standpoint, and one is contrasting that or juxtaposing that against the other epics of the canon. What are some of these literary sort of nuances that stand out, either in the way that the narrative is shaped, or the drama is built up, or the nonlinear style of storytelling, way back 2.5 millennia? Are there significant literary nuances that stand out, which distinguish it not just from others in the milieu, but if you're talking about world literature as a sweep, very distinct from the others?
Thank you, Avik, for having invited me to this. As you said, I translate from Sanskrit to English, and most of those, not all, are published by Penguin. It says fording the epics. The word epic is normally used for Itihasa, which is the Ramayana, the Valmiki Ramayana, and the Mahabharata. I prefer to think of it as the Itihasa Purana Corpus, because the Puranas are connected certainly to the Mahabharata. And again, just purely for the record, my intention is to translate. And when I say translate, these are unabridged translations. To translate all the 18 Mahapuranas, to give some idea of the rough size that we are talking about, the Mahabharata is believed to have 100,000 shlokas. And my translation, as you said, ran to 10 volumes, which is about 2.25 million words. The 18 Puranas together account for 400,000 shlokas, so there will be about 12 million words. The Bhagavat Puran, the Markandeya Puran, the Brahma Puran, and the Vishnu Puran translations have already been published. The Shiva Puran will be published next month. Brahmanda Puran is pending with Penguin, and I'm on the Matsya Puran now. Now, before we talk about the Mahabharata, we will talk about the Mahabharata. Since this is on poetry, let me talk a little bit about poetry. Because all these texts that we are talking about, they were poetry. Prose, as we understand it, came into Sanskrit literature much later. Whenever we think of poetry, often, not invariably, but often we tend to think of rhyming. It is early in the morning, hence we are still in mourning. That's the kind of stuff we normally associate with poetry. Sanskrit poetry was not like that. Rhyming came to Sanskrit poetry much later. it essentially started, the rhyming part of that started essentially with Jayadeva and the Vaishnava poets, much, much later. Most of us have heard of the Dashavatar Stotram. Pralaya payodhi jale dhritavanasi vedam vihitava hitra charitram kedam. There is a rhyming, but that is Jayadeva. Sanskrit poetry was defined in terms of chandas. When we were in school, teachers would tell us, choti e, bari e. Now that's because we do not pronounce correctly. If we pronounce correctly, there is no need to say choti e and badi e. It's the way you pronounce it. And all Indian languages, including Sanskrit, you must open your mouth. If we speak English, we learn to speak it with your mouth relatively closed. Now, this was the first thing to understand about Sanskrit, you need to open your mouth. Anyway, so aksharas, which are syllables with a single vowel sound, they were divided into short and long, rasha and dirgha, depending on whether the vowel sound was short or long. And then you began to classify chandas or meters, depending on how many sounds, aksharas there were in a line, because typically there were 4 lines, pada. Typical shloka will have 4 lines, pada. Depending on how many aksharas there are in a line, and depending on the permutation and combination of the laghu and the guru, the rasha and the dirgha, you had more than 1200 different chandas. The Valmiki Ramayana tells us that Valmiki was the Adi Kavi and he composed the first shloka. As everyone knows, when he saw the hunter shoot the pair of birds, Ma nishada tvamagama pratishtvam shashvati samayat krauncha mithunat ekam vadhi kamo mohitam. And the Valmiki Ramayana tells us that that is the reason this came to be called a shloka from shoka or sorrow. Valmiki as a poet was a class apart. Valmiki was beautiful poetry in terms of describing nature, just as Kalidas was. When we are talking about the Mahabharata, which is what we are talking about, and the Puranas, these were believed to have been composed by Veda Vyasa. One of the most common chandas is Anushtup. We don't even realize it is Anushtup. It is the simplest shloka, a simplest chanda. And the structure of Anushtup is 8 aksharas per line. There is the permutation combination. I will not get into the permutation combination, but 8 aksharas per line. First shloka of the Bhagavad Gita, Dharma Kshetre Kurukshetre Samavetayutsava Mamakah Pandava Shaiva Kima Kurvata Sanjaya. You've heard this hundreds of times without realizing this is Anushtup. Dharma Kshetre Kurukshetre Samaveta Yuyutsava. In our mantras, we constantly use Anushtup. We don't realize that it is Anushtup. Vakratunda Mahakaya Surya Koti Samaprabha Ya Devi Sarva Bhuteshu. All Anushtup. It has influenced non-Sanskrit poems, songs. We don't realize it. Dhano dhane pushpe bhara Anushtup. They varied the chanda depending on the theme. For example, Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvhavati bharata. You can see that it is different. The poet chose it depending on the theme. For example, Kalidasa Meghdut, he wanted to mirror the cloud. Meghdutam, he wanted to mirror the cloud, short burst, long burst, short burst, long burst. So, Manda Kranta, which is a short, long. Kashchit Kanta Viraha Guruna Swadhikara Pramatta. You can see the chanda is different. Mandakranta, the one that most people are familiar with, is actually Shantakarang Bhujagashayanang Padmanabhang Sureshang. You can see it is visibly different from Anushtup. So, one of the great things about the Mahabharata, which no translation can bring out, is the superlative poetry.
Are the other Puranas also in Anushtup Chanda? And what Chanda does the Ramayana follow, which of course precedes the Mahabharata?
In the Itihasa Purana Corpus, the favorite Chanda, 80% plus, will be Anushtup, which is 8 aksharas, sometimes Trishtup with 11 aksharas. So essentially, Anushtup, variants of Anushtup or Trishtup. And as I said, when you wanted to deliberately introduce a discontinuity, for whatever reason, you varied it. Bhagavad Gita, Vishwarup Darshan, it is a completely different kind of chapter. So the chanda is completely different.
Obviously, when we're talking about an unabridged version or translation, shloka for shloka, it is exceptionally important to talk about fidelity. But even before we go there, let's maybe talk a little bit about authenticity. So you have, if I'm not mistaken, based your translation on the critical edition from the Bhandarkar Society. Now, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but Bibekda, right at the end of the Mahabharata, where it says, whatever is there in the world, it is there in the Mahabharata, whatever is not there is not there. Similarly, I think the very next page or the preceding one says that there are 100,000 shlokas in the Mahabharata, that same part. But the Bhandarkar edition probably has fewer, maybe 75 or 80,000 shlokas. So are there possibly other extant versions of the Mahabharata which are even more authentic and can account for these missing 20,000 shlokas?
I think I need to explain what the critical edition did. The Ramayana, the Valmiki Ramayana, is in a sense a single manuscript. There is a northern version, there is a southern version, but essentially it's a single manuscript. Someone was unhappy with what Valmiki depicted. He or she came along and composed another Ramayana, Yoga Vasishtha Ramayana, Adhyata Ramayana. The Mahabharata, those of us, I can't see anyone here that old, but those of us who are sufficiently old and used to travel on trains will remember hold alls. So the Mahabharata there. So the Mahabharata is a bit like a hold all. Everything got into it. It subsumed everything. Consequently, there were about 1215 different versions of the Mahabharata floating around in the country. All in Sanskrit. I'm not talking about non-Sanskrit versions at all. Those are different. About 1215 different versions of the Mahabharata floating around in the country, all varying from each other in minor detail. Did Veda Vyasa actually dictate to Ganesha or not? When Draupadi was being disrobed in the Sabha, did she pray to an anonymous divinity or was it Krishna by name? Not substantive differences, those kinds of differences. In 1916, the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute was set up in Pune with the specific task of sifting through these 1215 versions to see if they could, in some sense, determine what might have been the original. Might have been. Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute never claims that anyone is able to ever identify the original Mahabharata. That's impossible. There's subjectivity. What they did was very similar to what we did in school when we studied maths, which is the highest common factor, HCF. So if a shloka occurred in a large number of manuscripts, it was probably original. Now, this kind of thing is done in genetic work on genetics also. So it's pretty standard. Having done this, they produced the critical edition, which took them 50 years. So the last volume of the critical edition was published in 1966. After that, there is a text called the Harivangsha, which is not exactly a Purana. It is more like an appendix to the Mahabharata. They took another 4 years to do the Harivangsha, which was published in 1970. Bhandarkar never claims this is the original, because that's impossible to do. And Bhandarkar has not only published the critical edition, but has also published all the other different variants. So if I want all the other variants, I will get them courtesy Bhandarkar. It is the popular belief, as you said, as I myself said earlier, that the Mahabharata has 100,000 shlokas. The critical edition has just over 75,000 shlokas. If you add the Harivangsha, it comes to about 80,000. So it has removed some shlokas, and there are people who have criticized the critical edition, saying, why did you omit this shloka? But as I said, if you want all of them, Bhandarkar has published all of them.
Bibek, the question about language and part of this, the genesis of this question is pure happenstance. We were doing a presentation at EACPM last year in the month of August, end of August. And purely in passing, because we were talking about behavioral economics and behavioral sciences, we're talking about things like resilience and stress management and alienation and workplace well-being, etc. And Bibek mentioned just whilst the presentation was ongoing, there is no equivalent of stress in Sanskrit.
Boredom.
Or boredom. Stress, such
stress is
boredom, right? And I asked the obvious question: why is there no word for boredom in Sanskrit? And presumably, back in the day, people did not feel bored, and there was this no emotion around boredom. So now, if you talk about the entire spectrum of emotions and feelings that characterize the human condition today, talk about stress or boredom or alienation or loneliness or depression. Some of these may have equivalents, direct equivalents in Sanskrit, and some of them may not. Would it be fair to say that we can look at language per se and use the words extant in the vocabulary at a period of time to be an index of the human condition in that period?
Oh, we certainly can. But since you mentioned language, there are some words that are simply untranslatable, because whatever you do, you cannot really translate them satisfactorily into English. And that's obvious enough. A word like dharma, for example, I can't translate it adequately. A word like varna, I can't translate it adequately. But, and sometimes I'm asked this question, and this is a simple question to answer. But there is a more complicated response, and let me mention this, because I don't think it is adequately appreciated. The structure of English, or the nature of English, is completely different from the structure of Sanskrit or any Indian language. And I don't mean it in the sense of Sanskrit being a loose language, so the subject can be wherever, the verb can be wherever, it does not have to be subject, verb, object. I don't mean that. I mean something a little bit more profound. In Sanskrit, the verb is the most important thing. The noun, proper noun, they are secondary. The meaning of the noun or the proper noun is derived from the meaning of the word. So, for example, take a word like ajagara. Anyone would say, oh, ajagara is a python. It's a boa constrictor, as it is. But ajagara, to anyone who knows Sanskrit, would say, wait a minute, gara means to swallow, aja means to go, is a goat. So anything that swallows a goat is ajagara. It does not necessarily have to be a python or a boa constrictor. So to anyone who knows Sanskrit, the verb is there at the back of the mind. So out there I see a tree, and one of the words for a tree is padapaha. Any Westerner or Western educated person will say, oh, padapaha, tree. But what is padapaha? It is something that drinks water with its feet. So it is conjuring up for me the vision of not just tree, but drinking water with the feet. This chair, one of the words for asan, chair is asandaha. I hear asandaha, it is no longer chair. It is something that is giving me a posture. So if you notice that if it is someone who's not very westernized, and I say, what is your name? The person will not say, I am Avik. The I with a capital is always at the back in our language system. He will say, I am known as Avik, or my name is Avik. Often Westerners, including a guest that you have invited, make fun of this. And that's because Sanskrit words have multiple meanings. Of course they do, because you have not understood the basics, which is it is the verb that is important. Let me give you an example of how this causes slight problems of translation. Vasangsi jirnani yatha vihaya navani grinnati naro parani tatha sharirani vihaya jirnani anyani sangyati navani dehi. Bhagavad Gita, everyone has heard this. Next shloka. Nainang chindanti shastrani nainang dahati pavaka na chainang kledanti apa na shosheti maruta. Let's translate. Nainang chindanti shastrani. Weapons cannot cut it. Nainang chindanti shastrani. Nainang dahati pavakaha. The fire cannot burn it. Similarly, water cannot dry it. Similarly, water cannot dry it. Water cannot wet it. And fine. Immaculate translation. What that translation has not told me is, what do I have? I have shastra, weapons. What were they made from? Metals. Where did the metals come from? Earth. So I have earth, fire, water, and air. So it is the, out of the Panchabhutas, it is the four of the Panchabhutas, and the fifth one is everywhere. What is the word for fire? Multiple words. As I said, Sanskrit has multiple words. Friend, it will be difficult for me to think of synonyms for friend in English. In Sanskrit, I will be able to think of 12 different synonyms for friend, all of which mean something different based, as I said, on the verb. So fire, if I ask you, what is fire? Agni. What is being used here is not Agni, it is Pavakaha. And what is Pavakaha? Pavaka is not any fire. I said verb is important. Pavaka is something that purifies. If I just translate it as the fire cannot burn it, of course I'm being correct. But all these hidden nuances I will never be able to convey. So this is a much more serious problem of translating from Sanskrit than the simple one is, how do I translate dharma, how do I translate karma, how do I translate varna?
No, it's just spellbound. took me some time to process what you were saying. Uh, I'll come to something very specific, and then perhaps we can talk about the choices, the options that were open or available to the poet of the times, and the decisions that he took. This is again something that you and I have talked about before. Different perspectives, various perspectives. Most perspectives are from the viewpoints of the Pandavas or maybe from Draupadi, etc. But what we don't have in the abridged versions or in the films or serial versions of that is the so-called negative archetypes, right? And one of the things which is very predominant is before the battle begins, it's not just the predicament of Arjuna or the Pandavas, but it is also what Suryodhana or Duryodhana is doing and whom he goes to for seeking counsel, right? And one of the interesting things that you have pointed out in your translation, in your notes, is he does not go to Bhishma, he does not go to his father, he does not go to anyone, but he goes to Dronacharya, who is the guru, to seek counsel. And you know that various sort of semantic and philosophical hair-splitting analysts have asked and debated and tried to answer this particular thing. Why is it Dronacharya? It is because of this, etc., etc. And the answer that you've suggested was extremely innovative. You said it's entirely possible that the nuances of the plot or the very complex and tenuous relationship that Dronacharya may have had with Suryodhana is far less important, perhaps, and had nothing to do with it, but it just fitted the meter. It just fitted the rhyme of that shloka, and which is why Dronacharya is there. Let us assume for a second that that is indeed the reason why it is Dronacharya. It could have been somebody else. Then my question would be, as something that claims to be Itihasa, so that which has occurred, that which has happened, i.e., almost from a von Rankian kind of a formulation, this is authentic, empirical history. This is something that can be verified. Would it be fair to say that, at least just using this as one simple example, that there would have been conflicting demands of recording exactly what had happened as Vyasa or whoever the subsequent poets knew it to be, and the demands of Kavya, which meant that Dronacharya would be a better fit than Bhishma?
So you're asking two different questions at the same time. And so far as the first part of the question is concerned, people who are listening in may not have understood the context. What we have today is the texts as they have finally been crystallized in some form. There is some independent dating, independent of the texts, done of the Kurukshetra war, archaeology, geology, genetic evidence, etc., to validate this proposition about Itihasa. And we also know that the Mahabharata in its present form became a firm text by about 500 CE. So between the events occurring and the text getting some kind of final shape, 1,000 years had passed. So obviously over a period of 1,000 years, there will have been all kinds of embellishments, additions to the core story. Happens with everything else. For example, if I look at the Rigveda, in the earlier mandalas, the Saraswati is a thriving river, overflowing river. If I come to the later mandalas, it is no longer that. It is no longer that mighty river. It has not dried up as it has by the time of the Mahabharata, but it is no longer that mighty river. So over a period of time, now the incident that Avik is talking about is at the beginning of the Kurukshetra war. At the beginning of the Kurukshetra war, when Bhishma has not died, Bhishma is the commander of the army. And at the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, I already cited the first shloka. That's the only shloka that's actually spoken in the entire Bhagavad Gita by Dhritarashtra. Dhritarashtra asks Sanjaya, Dharma Kshetre Kurukshetre Samaveta Mamakah Pandava Shaiva Kima Kurvata Sanjaya. And Sanjaya answers, Dreshtva tu Pandavanikang Budang Duryadhanastada Acharyam Upasangamya Raja Vachanam Avravit. Duryadhan goes to Acharya Dronacharya, not to Bhishma. So the question is, why did he go to Dronacharya? Shouldn't he have gone to Bhishma? And all kinds of people have speculated about this. Oh, Dronacharya was a bit like a salaried employee. He was paid. Bhishma was not paid. Maybe that's the reason. Oh, Dronacharya was a Brahmana. Maybe he might decide not to fight. So all kinds of people have speculated on this. The thought that Avik mentioned, it is just a thought, speculative thought, is, let me give you a different thing. I'm going to cite a shloka and you tell me where this is from. Don't react instantly. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvhavati parantapa abhyuthanang adharmasya tadatmanang srijamyam. Where is this from? Gita says, Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvhavati bharata abhyuthanang adharmasya tadatmanang srijamyam. What I cited was Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvhavati parantapa. What is the difference? Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvhavati bharata. The Anushtup Chanda is intact. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvhavati parantapa. It breaks down. Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvhavati parantapa occurs elsewhere in the Mahabharata, not in the Bhagavad Gita, which means that the person who did that bit was not as skilled a poet as Vedavyasa was. It was a later interpolation. Speculation, but that's what I think. Similarly, if you are doing Anushtup, which, remember, 8 aksharas, it is easier to handle names that have 4 aksharas, even 2 aksharas. So, I will have shlokas in the Mahabharata on Satyavati. I will have Draupadi, and I will call her, of course, not Draupadi, I will call her Yagyaseni. So these will naturally occur to a poet. And thousands of years later, we will speculate about the powerful women characters in the Mahabharata. Why is Ambika not there as much as Amba is there? And maybe it was just a poetic thing. Similarly, Dronacharya, Acharya, because of that particular shloka, if I want to make it stick to Anushtup, Bhishma would not have done. So this pure trivial speculation. I think that all that happened was he was just trying to fit in that rhyme, and later on people have written academic papers on when he went to Dronacharya.
When you're talking about translation, how difficult, and particularly translations of something as subtle, as nuanced, as complex as the epics, as the Itihasa Purana, how difficult is it to subsume, or if I may use that, the Buddhist or the Hindu concept of Atma Vinash, to kill the ego of myself when I immerse oneself in the text? Because very often, and we see this more in British or other 20th century poets translating from the Russian, translating from the French, and the stamp of the translator is unmistakable. Does that present a challenge to you? And if so, what is the way around it?
I don't think so. Meaning, I'm reminded of what Chapman said in his translation of Homer, to the effect that my job as a translator is to depict accurately what Homer said. I, as a translator, should not intrude. And I think that is the essential job of any translator, to depict exactly, to state exactly what Vedavyasa had said. And since I wanted to conform to the shloka structure, the English, as the translations themselves say, the introductions say, they are not as smooth as the English is not necessarily that smooth, because I wanted to stick to that structure. Absolutely correct. So if the text says Kaunteya, I will keep it as Kaunteya. I will not take the liberty of changing it to Arjuna. But there are things that require explanation. Let me give an example of that, not from the Mahabharata. I'm giving an example from the Markandeya Purana. Towards the beginning of the Markandeya Purana, it says, Duryodhan was Balaram's Jamatri. Jamatri, Jamata, everyone would say son-in-law. And the Markandeya Purana may have been not translated that many times into English, but it's been translated into other languages. So I looked up all the translations, and lo and behold, everyone says son-in-law. But there is no record of Duryodhan ever having been Balaram's son-in-law. So then I looked up multiple dictionaries. And remember what I said, in Sanskrit, every word has several different meanings. And there was a minor meaning of Jamatri, which is someone who's loved. So that is all that it is meant. And of course, Duryodhan was loved by Balarama as a favored disciple. Or take a completely different example again. The Shraddha is being done. Yudhishthir wants to do the Shraddha of Karna and Jayadratha. This is not the Shraddha that happens immediately after the war. It is the Shraddha that happens 1 year later. So he goes and takes Bhishma's permission. I want to do Jayadratha's Shraddha and I want your permission. And it's been, Mahabharata has been translated into other languages before, if not in English. So translators have said, oh, he needed the permission because Jayadratha was evil. Doesn't sound right. So were a lot of people, different people. To me, that permission was needed is who was Jayadratha? Jayadratha was Dushyala's husband. This was a different family. This family did not have the right to perform Jayadratha's Shraddha. That belonged to a different family. That is the need the permission was required. Now, how do you ensure that these things are brought to the attention of the reader? I do that through my footnotes. So all of these examples that I've given are through the footnotes. So far as the text is concerned, my intention is to keep it as authentic to what Vedavyasa said as is possible, everything else relegated to the footnotes. The first volume of the Mahabharata was most difficult. Over a period of time, I have got after all, I'm translating the same author. And I've got very used to Vedavyasa's style. So I can sort of almost mechanically, blindly translate a Vedavyasa shloka now. Except, this is also dharma. This is also adhyatya dharma. This is also the metaphysical. So if you take any shloka, in 85% of the time, straight, type it out. No issues. Sometimes I have to research something. This particular river, where is it today? Because I want to make it clear to the reader. And sometimes I get stuck on, after all, as I said, this is adhyatya dharma. So what exactly does this mean? We hear the word yoga and we think yoga means something. Yoga has all kinds of different meanings depending on different contexts. I've just given this as an example. So this is how it works.
We can't probably get entirely away from economics and statistics. And I wanted to pose a question, a statistical question, on a ridiculously small sample size of 3. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but shloka for shloka, verse for verse, if you're talking about the unabridged critical version of the Mahabharata, thus far, there have only been 3 complete translations. The first one, back in the 1890s, 1880s,
Kishori Mohan Ganguly.
Kishori Mohan Ganguly. The second is just a decade later, and that is Monmouthnath. And the third is yourself. And I don't know, coincidence or otherwise, so I don't know if you're talking about storks or babies and kind of correlation, but all 3 translators of the complete unabridged Mahabharata happen to be Bengalis. Are we to infer something from this? Or is it pure coincidence?
Well, there are others who have tried to translate it. They have died before it was completed. No, but yes, I think we should infer something from it. 19th century, mid-19th century, and these are, by the way, translations in English. Mid-19th century, Bengal was amongst the first provinces to be exposed to Western education. Generated a lot of interest in English, generated a lot of interest in our heritage as defined by this corpus. The first translation of any Purana, the Vishnu Purana, was done by Horace Wilson, published by the Asiatic Society under Bibliotheca Indica. Hariprasad Shastri goes off to the Royal Library in Nepal because it was the only one which had maintained some texts of the Puranas, and brings them back, published in Sanskrit by the Asiatic Society under the Bibliotheca Indica series. The first Bengali translation, unabridged, done of the Mahabharata by Kali Prasanna Singha. Michael Madhusudan Datta writing his own version of the Ramayana. Ashutosh Mukhopadhyay's father, a fact that is not known, doing his own composition of the Ramayana. Today, if you go to Kolkata and you want to find a text of the Puranas, Panchanan Tarkaratna, actually published in the 1890s. So I'm making 2 double points here. 1, exposure to English education. B, the exposure to education in general leading to an attempt to rediscover all of this. Also, Bengal is a rather odd state in the sense that the Varna system as we know it elsewhere doesn't quite exist in Bengal. The Brahmanas exist. In between, firstly, remember that Bengal, Greater Bengal, was ruled by the Palas for a long period of time. And the Palas, although not the kingdom, but the kings were Buddhists. Chaitanya movement led to a great church. What am I driving home? And I am not, there is some truth in it, but I don't want to obviously exaggerate the point. All of these translations, not all, bulk of these translations were done by non-Brahmins. And in many other parts of the country, these texts are regarded as the exclusive preserve of Brahmanas. What was characteristic about Bengal, whether it is Kali Prasanna Singha, whether it is Manmatha Datta, whether it is Bibek Debroy, all non-Bengalis. I mean, non-Brahmins.
Bibek, this has been absolutely fascinating and an honor and a privilege. This hour, I think, has been truly enchanted. But before we let you go, and I'm sure you have multiple other appointments and meetings to go to, maybe thoughts, comments, questions?
I'm very curious to hear a little bit about two things, if possible. One is your personal journey toward this translation, how you came to undertake this project, and also what your thoughts, because we're at the University of Chicago Center here, and many faculty at the university have been engaged in translating the Mahabharata collectively over the years. What your thoughts are about some of the different English language translations that are currently happening in different contexts outside of India or elsewhere?
Well, the clay edition was an attempt to translate the non-Sanskrit versions. And so far as I'm concerned, the more people read about this corpus, the better it is. And the more people read about this corpus in unabridged form, the better it is, because in abridged form we tend to simplify and we tend to reduce everything to black and white. Things are not black and white. Preferably they should read it in the Sanskrit. If they can't, then, well, the more the better. My personal journey, I don't know how to answer that, in the sense that I've never formally studied Sanskrit. I learned Sanskrit at the age of 45. There are two ways I can respond to your question. One way I can respond to your question, especially if it is coming from the University of Chicago, is I was unhappy with some of the translations that were being done, including several words and expressions used by Van Buitenen, which is the half-finished University of Chicago translation. Now, at one level, that is a completely negative reaction. If you're unhappy about the translation, you might as well do the translation yourself. Unfortunately, the Brahmanas, the Indologists, and the Pandits, they were not interested in translating it, which is why I got dragged into this. This is one kind of answer to the University of Chicago with the I capitalized. To an Indian audience, I say that the I is never capitalized. And all kinds of things have happened in my life. We don't have the time to recount all of these, which illustrate that some unseen force, destiny, whatever you choose to call it, have led me down this path, and I've just become the instrument for doing this. Nimitta matrang bhava sabvyasachin. And that actually is the truthful answer. I don't have the time to describe all of these different coincidences.
I see perfect stillness, almost that of a
Boredom.
seance. No, almost that of a seance. I think people are still very, very entranced and processing and trying to absorb all that you said. Thank you so much. Thank you so very much, Bibek. Can we have a huge round of applause?